Maria Larson had always believed that privacy was the last true luxury. Her small home at the end of Willow Lane had been her quiet refuge for nearly 15 years, a modest single-story house surrounded by rose bushes and tall cedar trees that shielded the backyard from the rest of the world. After retiring from 30 years of teaching literature, she had filled her days with gardening, reading, and hosting her grandchildren every other weekend. The backyard was her favorite place, sunlight streaming through the leaves, the sound of wind chimes she had collected from her travels, the faint smell of mint and lavender drifting through the air. It was the kind of sanctuary that took years to build and only a moment to destroy. That moment came the day her new neighbor, Josh Harrison, moved in next door. At first, Maria had greeted him politely, the way she always did with newcomers. He was in his mid-30s, lean and restless, with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. He worked in tech security, as he described it, and spent his first weekend drilling fixtures into the walls, setting up equipment around his house. Maria thought little of it at first. Everyone wanted to feel safe. But within a week, she began to notice the faint hum of electronics from his property, the quiet click of lenses adjusting somewhere beyond her fence. One afternoon, while trimming the roses, she saw it clearly for the first time, a small black camera mounted high on his gutter, its lens angled unmistakably toward her backyard. The sight made her chest tighten. It wasn't paranoia, it was precision. The camera wasn't just catching part of her fence. It was aimed directly at her patio table, the place where she drank her morning tea and read her newspaper. At first, she told herself it was probably an accident, a careless setup, maybe even part of a wider security system. She decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. But a few evenings later, when she walked outside at dusk to water her plants, she caught a faint reflection. Another lens, this one deeper in his yard, pointed through the lattice toward her porch. Her peace, once tangible and constant, began to crumble. Every movement suddenly felt exposed. The way she tied her hair, the moments she spoke on the phone, the quiet humming she did while cleaning. It wasn't fear yet, but something heavier, a slow-burning dread that settled beneath her ribs. The final confirmation came on a Sunday morning. Her grandchildren, Noah and Lily, were playing in the inflatable pool she had set up for them when she noticed Josh on his deck with his phone raised. He wasn't taking a selfie or chatting. He was watching. His eyes flicked between the screen and her yard with casual indifference, as if observing a public space rather than someone's private life. When he noticed her looking, he didn't even flinch, just gave a small, almost mocking nod and walked inside. Maria stood frozen, the sound of the children's laughter blurring into background noise. A hollow sensation spread through her stomach. She realized that every moment she had thought was hers alone, the quiet breakfasts, the afternoons of gardening, the private talks with her daughter, might have been recorded, archived, and replayed by a stranger behind the fence. That night, she couldn't sleep. The once familiar creaks of her home now made her flinch. The curtains stayed drawn, and every shadow on the wall seemed alive. She caught herself whispering, as if the walls might carry her voice to him. The thought that her sanctuary could be violated so easily made her tremble with helpless anger. It wasn't just about a camera. It was about being watched without consent, stripped of the small dignity that made a home feel like a safe place. Maria had spent a lifetime teaching her students that justice begins with standing up for truth, and now she found herself tested by her own lesson. As she sat at her kitchen table staring at the faint glow of Josh's security lights beyond the window, one thought anchored in her mind. If he wanted a fight, he had just found one. The next morning, Maria woke with a pounding in her chest that felt heavier than any dream. The light filtering through the curtains was thin and cold, and for a long while she simply sat at the edge of her bed, listening to the quiet pulse of the neighborhood beyond her window. The camera still faced her backyard. She could sense it, an unblinking mechanical eye that had already changed the way she moved through her own home. She tried to convince herself it was a misunderstanding, that Josh would be reasonable if she simply explained how uncomfortable it made her feel. After all, She had spent decades teaching young people to reason through conflict rather than escalate it. So she dressed carefully, smoothing her cardigan, and walked next door, rehearsing polite but firm sentences in her head. Josh answered the door almost instantly, as though he had been expecting her. The faint smell of coffee and machine oil drifted out from inside his modern, sterile home. His smile was practiced, cordial but dismissive, the kind people used when they had already decided not to listen. Maria explained that she had noticed the camera aimed toward her property, and that she would appreciate it if he could adjust it slightly. She even offered to show him the angle from her side of the fence to make her concern clear. Josh crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe with the lazy arrogance of someone who believed he was right before the conversation had even begun. "It's a security system," he said. "It covers my yard and part of the street. If you happen to be visible in the background, that's not my problem." His tone was smooth but sharp, laced with the quiet cruelty of certainty. When she tried to reason with him, pointing out that it invaded her privacy, he shrugged. "Maybe you shouldn't be doing anything you wouldn't want people to see." The words hit her like a slap. There was no misunderstanding. He knew exactly what he was doing. Maria returned home shaking, her thoughts tangled between humiliation and disbelief. That night, she kept the lights dimmed and avoided the windows, afraid of becoming the subject of another recording. She told herself she would call the homeowners association the next day, perhaps even the police if needed. Surely someone would understand how wrong this was. But the next morning brought a new shock. Another camera had appeared, smaller and higher, attached to a tree near the property line. This one looked directly into her kitchen window. The violation was now undeniable, deliberate, and methodical. She contacted the local police, her voice trembling as she described the situation. The officer on the phone was polite but detached, asking a few procedural questions before sighing. "Ma'am, if the camera's on his property and it's not physically recording inside your home, there's not much we can do. He's within his rights to monitor his surroundings." Maria tried to explain that the camera captured her backyard, her grandchildren, her private moments, but the officer's tone grew impatient. "Unless he's posting the footage or threatening you, this doesn't constitute a crime." When the call ended, Maria felt smaller than she had in years. The law, it seemed, was blind to the feeling of being watched. Over the following days, the tension became a constant pulse beneath her skin. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the invisible gaze follow her. Her once joyful garden became foreign territory, her patio a stage on which she was unwillingly performing. Even inside her house, the thought of those cameras made her flinch. She stopped opening the blinds, stopped watering her plants, stopped reading on the porch. The silence around her grew suffocating. She began to question herself. Was she overreacting, as some of her neighbors hinted with uncomfortable smiles when she mentioned the situation? One even said, "Josh seems like a nice guy. Maybe he's just cautious." The implication stung more than she expected. Then, one afternoon, as she carried groceries from her car, she caught sight of Josh standing on his deck again, phone in hand, pointing directly toward her yard. This time, she didn't pretend it was coincidence. Her heart pounded, and without thinking, she shouted across the fence, demanding that he stop filming her. Josh lowered his phone slowly and smirked. "Public view," he said, his voice calm and dripping with condescension. "You can't own what the eye can see." She was shaking so hard she could barely form words. That night, her sleep came in jagged fragments, each one haunted by the image of that camera, red light blinking in the dark like a heartbeat she could not silence. 2 days later, she noticed something worse. Her youngest grandson, Lily, had found the courage to return to the backyard, playing with her doll under the sun. Maria, watching from the window, felt a fleeting warmth, until she heard Josh's voice from the other side of the fence, casual but distinct, saying something about getting good angles. It wasn't shouted. It was the kind of tone meant to be heard just enough to make someone uneasy. Maria's stomach turned cold. She rushed outside, shielding Lily with her arm, yelling at him to stay away and stop recording. He didn't reply, only smiled faintly before walking inside his house. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table with her daughter, Emma, trying to explain everything that had happened. Emma listened, torn between anger and disbelief. "Mom, you need to document this," she said. "If the police won't help, maybe a lawyer will." She helped her mother take photos of the cameras, the view angles, even screenshots from where the lenses were clearly pointed toward her home. For the first time in days, Maria felt a glimmer of control return. But when she stepped outside the next morning to take one last picture, she saw a new addition on the fence, a metal sign that read, "Smile, you're on camera." The deliberate cruelty of it made her throat tighten. By the end of the week, Maria had stopped using her backyard entirely. The curtains stayed drawn, the garden wilted, and the sound of her grandchildren's laughter faded from the place that had once been filled with joy. Yet beneath her fear, something else began to stir, a quiet, persistent rage. She had been kind, patient, and reasonable, and it had only emboldened him. He was using the very laws meant to protect safety as weapons of humiliation. As she sat in the dim light of her kitchen, surrounded by photographs and notes, she realized that this wasn't about neighborly conflict anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, about proving that privacy wasn't a favor granted by others, but a right she was willing to defend. She would not wait for another morning of dread or another glance over her shoulder. For the first time in her life, Maria decided she would fight back, and this time, she would make sure that the entire world saw what he had done. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of unease and mounting fury. Maria could no longer separate the days by sunlight or routine, only by the number of times she caught the faint mechanical glint of Josh's cameras shifting toward her property. It became a pattern, deliberate and suffocating. Every time she opened a door or stepped outside, she felt the air thicken with invisible attention, as if her very presence triggered some alert in his system. The garden that had once symbolized calm was now a silent battlefield, where each leaf seemed to rustle with suspicion. She tried to return to normalcy, watering the plants, reading on her porch, but her body refused. Her every movement felt watched, dissected, and stored. The laughter of her grandchildren had vanished from the backyard. They refused to play there now, frightened by the strange man next door who pointed strange blinking devices at them. The house itself seemed to shrink around her, a cage of curtains and shadows. When she finally called the police again, her voice trembled with restrained desperation. She explained that the cameras were multiplying, that they now pointed toward her windows, that her neighbor had been seen recording her grandchildren. The officer she spoke to was different from the first, but carried the same bureaucratic detachment. "Ma'am, unless the footage is being shared publicly, or there's physical trespassing, this doesn't qualify as a criminal act. You might want to install your own fence or cameras for peace of mind." The suggestion felt like an insult. Why should she have to fortify her life against someone else's intrusion? She hung up, her hand trembling, staring at her reflection in the dark glass of her phone screen. That night she barely slept, every creak of the house making her heart leap. A few days later, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a ladder, climbed carefully to the top of her fence, and held her phone steady to capture clear evidence of the camera's angle. She was halfway through recording when the sound of a door opening made her freeze. Josh stood in his yard, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same disinterested smirk. "Need help with something?" he asked. She lowered the phone slowly, her stomach twisting with dread and rage. "You need to remove those cameras," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "You're violating my privacy." Josh stepped closer, his tone mockingly calm. "You're standing on your fence recording my property, and you're accusing me of violation? You might want to be careful about who's breaking the law here." He turned and walked back inside, but she knew what would come next. The following morning, there was a notice taped to her front door, a formal complaint from the Homeowners Association, claiming she had engaged in invasive recording and harassment. It bore Josh's signature. The sheer audacity of it left her shaking with disbelief. He had flipped the situation completely, turning her attempt to protect herself into an accusation. When she tried to contact the HOA office, she was told that all complaints must be processed formally and that a hearing could be scheduled within 60 business days. 60 days of being filmed, humiliated, and gaslit. That afternoon, her daughter Emma came by and found her mother sitting motionless at the kitchen table, the letter spread before her like a piece of evidence from a crime. Emma read it twice before letting out a sharp exhale. "He's not just violating your privacy, Mom. He's trying to intimidate you into silence. You need to get legal help now." Maria hesitated. She had never imagined herself as someone who would sue another person. Conflict had always been something she avoided, even when she was right. But this wasn't about stubborn pride. It was about being stripped of peace, about waking each morning to a world where even the air felt observed. She agreed to meet a lawyer, though she dreaded how far this might go. That same night, she found her recycling bins overturned across the driveway, trash scattered like a deliberate insult. Her hands shook as she cleaned it up, but what frightened her most was not the mess. It was the quiet laughter she heard faintly from Josh's deck. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. The situation escalated further when her grandson Noah, visiting one weekend, threw a ball over the fence by accident. Before Maria could retrieve it, Josh stormed out of his house, waving the ball in his hand. "Teach your kids not to trespass," he shouted, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Next time I'll call the police for property damage." Maria's voice broke as she tried to explain, but he was already taking pictures of the scene with his phone, documenting it as if building another file against her. That night, Maria's hands trembled so violently she could barely hold her cup of tea. She began writing everything down in a notebook, every incident, every interaction, every unsettling glance, afraid that without proof, her experience might disappear into denial. When she finally met the attorney, a young woman named Chloe Sanders, she was nearly in tears. Chloe listened without interruption, her expression tightening as Maria described each detail. When Maria finished, Chloe leaned forward, her tone calm but resolute. "What he's doing isn't just inconsiderate. It's a pattern of harassment. The law can protect you, but we'll need to build a strong case. We'll document everything. Angles, timestamps, statements. If he's filming your private space intentionally, that's actionable." For the first time in months, Maria felt the faintest thread of hope. But even as they began to gather evidence, Josh seemed to sense that she was fighting back. His behavior grew bolder. He started leaving his porch lights on all night, flooding her windows with harsh white glare. The constant hum of his security system became a background noise that followed her through her dreams. One evening, when she stepped outside to collect the mail, she saw him standing in his yard again, phone in hand, pretending to talk while his camera lens pointed directly at her. "Smile," he said under his breath, just loud enough to reach her. She froze, then turned and went back inside without a word. Her nerves frayed further with each passing day. Simple tasks, watering plants, opening blinds, walking to the mailbox, became acts of quiet defiance. Every time she thought she could no longer bear the tension, something new happened. A flicker of red light in her kitchen window, a faint clicking sound from the trees, the sense that her life had been reduced to a series of digital files stored on someone else's device. The house that once felt alive with memory had turned into a vault of dread. Yet beneath the fear, a slow transformation was taking place. She realized she no longer felt only victimized. She was angry, and anger, unlike fear, carried direction. When Chloe called to say that she had arranged for a formal letter demanding the removal of the cameras, Maria's voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. "Send it," she said, "and make sure he knows I'm done being quiet." That night, As she stood at the window and looked toward the faint glow of the cameras through the darkness, Maria no longer felt invisible. The fear that had consumed her for weeks began to harden into resolve. He wanted her small, humiliated, and compliant, but he had underestimated her. She might have been alone in that house, but she was not powerless. For the first time since the nightmare began, Maria allowed herself a fragile smile. The game Josh had started was about to change, and this time, the rules would not be his. The letter Chloe drafted was sharp, professional, and uncompromising, outlining in exact language how Josh Harrison's surveillance system constituted a violation of privacy, and demanding that the cameras directed toward Maria's property be removed immediately. It was not just a threat of legal action, but a statement of defiance. When Maria watched Chloe slide the envelope into the post office slot, she felt a surge of relief unlike anything she had felt in months. For the first time, someone believed her. Someone was speaking in the language that men like Josh understood, cold, factual, and wrapped in the weight of law. Yet even as that hope flickered, she knew this man would not back down quietly. He had built his identity on control, and Maria's resistance was an insult he would not forgive. Days passed without a response. The neighborhood remained deceptively calm. The drone of lawnmowers, children riding bikes, neighbors waving in polite ignorance of the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Maria spent those days documenting everything as Chloe had instructed. She wrote down every movement, every sound of mechanical whirring, every glint of a lens shifting toward her windows. The first reply came not through a letter, but through an act of provocation. One afternoon, while Maria was tending to her flowers, a soft buzzing sound filled the air. She looked up and froze. A drone hovered just above the fence line, its small camera eye gleaming in the sunlight. It tilted slightly, following her as she stepped backward. Her pulse thundered as she realized Josh had escalated again, not satisfied with stationary cameras. He was now taking surveillance into the air. She shouted for him to stop, but the only response was the soft mechanical hum of the drone drifting back toward his yard like a taunt. That night, Maria sat in her darkened living room, trembling, the sound of that whirring still echoing in her mind. When she told Chloe about the incident, the lawyer's calm professionalism cracked. "He's taunting you," she said firmly. "This goes beyond privacy invasion. It's harassment and emotional abuse. We'll add it to the case." She filed for a restraining order and requested an emergency hearing. But before the court could respond, Josh made his next move. A thick envelope appeared in Maria's mailbox, marked legal notice. Inside was a copy of a complaint filed against her by Josh Harrison himself, claiming defamation and harassment. The absurdity of it would have been almost laughable if it hadn't felt so sinister. He accused her of making false public statements that damaged his reputation, and of attempting to interfere with his lawful use of private security devices. It was a mirror image of her own case, twisted into an accusation. Maria felt the air leave her lungs as she read the pages. He wasn't just watching her. He was trying to bury her in fear and paperwork. Chloe met with her the next morning. "This is exactly what abusers do when they're cornered," she said, her voice tight. "They reverse the narrative, make you look irrational, force you to spend your energy defending yourself instead of attacking the real issue. But this also means we're close to breaking him. He's reacting." Those words became a small anchor in Maria's storm of dread. She clung to them, even when the days blurred together in endless waiting. The hearing for her injunction was scheduled 2 weeks later. Until then, Chloe advised her to remain calm, document everything, and avoid confrontation. But calm was no longer possible. The cameras were now multiplying. She counted 4 at last, their faint red lights like unblinking eyes in the night. One was positioned so that it reflected directly off her kitchen window, making it impossible for her to cook without feeling the stare of that mechanical lens. It wasn't just the devices anymore. It was the psychological invasion. Josh had turned her home into a stage, her fear into his entertainment. He began to stand outside more often, always at the edge of his property, sometimes just watching, sometimes pretending to check his phone. His presence was quiet but deliberate, the kind of provocation meant to break a person without ever crossing the line of legality. The stress began to affect Maria physically. Headaches, sleepless nights, trembling hands. Her daughter begged her to stay with her for a while, but Maria refused. Leaving would mean surrendering the space that was hers. It would mean letting him win. When the day of the hearing finally came, Maria felt as if she were stepping into battle. Chloe had prepared her thoroughly, rehearsing every answer, every possible argument Josh's lawyer might make. Still, her nerves burned as she walked into the small courthouse, the sterile smell of the hall pressing around her like a cage. Josh was already there, sitting with a lawyer who looked as though he belonged more to a corporate boardroom than a neighborhood dispute. He smiled faintly when he saw her, a slow, smug curl of his lips that made her stomach twist. The hearing began with procedural language, but soon it became clear that this was more than a formality. Josh's lawyer painted him as a responsible homeowner, merely protecting his property, while portraying Maria as an overly emotional retiree driven by paranoia. Each word felt like a small knife twisting deeper into her resolve. But Chloe's counter-argument was sharp and relentless. She presented photographs showing the exact camera angles, technical assessments proving that the lenses captured more than Josh's property, and even a witness statement from a delivery driver who had overheard Josh joking about his neighbor's paranoia and how she probably didn't even realize how much he saw. The mediator, a woman in her 50s with a steady gaze, listened intently as the evidence piled up. Then Chloe presented something unexpected, a short video clip extracted from a public social media post, showing Josh demonstrating his home surveillance setup to a friend. In the clip, he laughed while pointing to a live feed that clearly displayed Maria's backyard and patio. "You can catch everything," his voice said, distorted slightly by the recording but unmistakable. The silence that followed was thick. For the first time, Josh's confidence faltered. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, murmuring something about taken out of context. But the damage was done. The mediator's tone turned cold. "Mr. Harrison, this is no longer a question of security. This is a question of intent." After the session ended, Maria stepped outside the courthouse into the late afternoon light, her legs weak, but her heart steady. Chloe assured her that the evidence was overwhelming and that a formal restraining order and damages suit were now inevitable. "We've crossed the midpoint," she said quietly. "Now he's the one cornered." Maria nodded, feeling the words settle deep within her like a quiet truth. She knew the fight wasn't over. People like Josh didn't retreat easily. But for the first time in months, the fear in her chest loosened. The cameras were still there, the memories still raw, but she had shifted from victim to opponent. That night, when she returned home, she stood in her dark kitchen and stared through the glass, toward the glowing dots of his cameras. She no longer saw them as all-powerful eyes, but as evidence, each one a piece of his guilt that would eventually crush him. For a long time, she stayed there, letting the silence of her house wrap around her, breathing deeply. The air felt different, no longer suffocating but charged with determination. She thought of her students, of the lessons she had once given about resilience and integrity, and she realized that she was living those words now in a way she never had before. Josh might still think he owned the view, but soon the world would see what he had done, and the gaze that once belonged to him would turn against him. The days after the hearing were supposed to bring peace, but instead they brought a deeper, colder kind of tension. Josh had lost his composure in that courtroom. Maria had seen it in his eyes when the mediator questioned his intent. For a man who thrived on control, being exposed was humiliation, and humiliation in men like him never came without retaliation. The first sign arrived 3 mornings later, a yellow notice taped neatly to her front door. It bore the official seal of the Homeowners Association and claimed that multiple complaints had been filed against her for violating neighborhood guidelines, including obstructing visibility, unauthorized installation of recording equipment, and aggressive behavior toward fellow residents. Maria stared at the letter until her hands shook. The accusations were absurd, almost surreal, yet the tone was formal and cold, the kind that demanded attention under threat of penalty. The signature at the bottom confirmed what she already knew. Josh Harrison, acting as a new member of the HOA board. He had found another way to use power as a weapon. When she showed the notice to Chloe, the lawyer's mouth tightened into a grim line. "He's leveraging the association to intimidate you," she said. "They can't enforce this without due process, but he's trying to drain your patience and credibility. He wants to make you look like the problem." Maria could only nod, her chest tight with frustration. She had spent her entire life following rules, respecting boundaries, and now every word in that document made her sound like an unruly nuisance. It wasn't just about cameras anymore. It was about dismantling her reputation, one official complaint at a time. Chloe promised to handle the legal side, but Maria knew that every new letter, every visit from the HOA's so-called inspection committee, would remind her that Josh was still pulling strings behind the scenes. The harassment grew subtler, more psychological. The floodlight on Josh's porch began turning on every night at the exact moment she entered her kitchen, blindingly bright, angled so that it reflected against her window. If she stepped outside, the light would stay on. When she went back in, it would turn off. It was precision disguised as coincidence. Then came the noise, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from his security system. It ran at odd hours, enough to wake her from sleep, but too faint to identify as a violation. The effect was cumulative, gnawing at her nerves until exhaustion blurred the line between vigilance and paranoia. Some nights she would walk through her house whispering to herself, reminding her body that she was safe, even when her mind no longer believed it. One afternoon, Maria decided to confront him directly for the last time. She walked across the driveway, the HOA letter clutched in her trembling hand, and knocked on his door. Josh opened it with an expression of forced politeness, his eyes glittering with amusement. "Back again?" he said softly. "You really can't stay away." Maria ignored the taunt. "You're using the HOA to harass me. You're abusing every rule you can find just to make my life miserable." He chuckled, the sound low and infuriating. "It's not harassment if it's legal, Maria. Maybe you should focus on following the community standards instead of accusing people who actually do." She felt her composure slipping, anger rising like static under her skin. "You've violated every moral and human boundary there is," she said. "You think the law will protect you forever, but you're wrong. It's catching up to you." His smile faded for a moment, and in that flicker she saw the truth. He was afraid, though he would rather burn everything around him than show it. "Be careful," he murmured, voice cold now. "You're not as untouchable as you think." That evening, the drone returned. It hovered lower this time, just above the fence line, close enough that the mechanical whine filled her yard like a swarm of insects. Maria froze, her pulse racing, and for a moment she thought she saw her own reflection in its glossy lens. Then something inside her snapped. She grabbed a broom, swung it upward, and struck the drone hard enough to send it tumbling into the grass. It crashed with a metallic crack, one of its rotors splintering against the stones of her garden path. For a long minute she just stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the broken machine. The satisfaction of silence afterward was electric, but the victory was short-lived. Within an hour, a police car pulled up outside her house, red and blue lights flickering across her darkened windows. The officer who stepped out looked tired, rehearsed, already skeptical. "Ma'am, your neighbor filed a report. He says you destroyed his property." Maria explained what had happened, her words coming too fast, hands shaking as she pointed to the shattered drone lying by the fence. The officer listened with professional detachment before sighing. "This is a civil matter. I can't arrest you for damaging a drone on your own property, but I suggest you avoid further conflict. Otherwise, this could escalate. When he left, the house felt colder than ever. She knew Josh was watching from somewhere, reveling in her helplessness. It wasn't enough for him to violate her privacy. He wanted to make her reaction look like instability. He was building a narrative, brick by brick, that painted her as the aggressor. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one not from the HOA, but from a local law firm representing Josh. It demanded restitution for the intentional destruction of surveillance property and threatened a defamation suit unless she publicly apologized. Chloe read it carefully before tossing it onto her desk with disgust. He's trying to bait you into fear again. We're going to file an emergency injunction to stop him from using any recording devices until the main hearing. Let him know that every step he takes digs him deeper. The firmness in her voice steadied Maria for a moment, but inside she felt the weight of exhaustion settle like lead. Every night was a battle to fall asleep without imagining another letter, another drone, another whisper through the fence. The neighborhood began to shift subtly, too. Some neighbors, who had once smiled at her in passing, now avoided eye contact. Rumors spread that she was unstable, that she was suing everyone in sight. The isolation cut deeper than any of the legal threats. She overheard one woman say near the mailbox, "She's just lonely. Probably made it all up." Maria walked back into her house that day with her jaw set, tears stinging but never falling. If Josh's goal was to make her a pariah, he was succeeding. But he had underestimated how anger could evolve into something sharper than fear. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the lights off, her eyes fixed on the faint red dots blinking from Josh's property. She no longer saw them as eyes of power, but as evidence, glowing reminders of his guilt. She thought of every humiliation, every sleepless night, and the faces of her grandchildren asking why they couldn't play in her yard anymore. Something inside her hardened completely. "No more," she whispered. She picked up her phone and called Chloe, her voice steady, stripped of all trembling. "Do it," she said simply. "File everything we can. Make sure he never points another camera at anyone again." When she hung up, Maria looked out into the darkness and saw her reflection in the window. Not the frightened woman she had been, but someone unyielding, someone who had endured enough to understand that justice was not given. It was taken. The fear had turned to resolve, and beneath the hum of machines, she could almost hear it, the quiet sound of the tide turning. The court date arrived under a sky the color of steel, and Maria woke before dawn, her body humming with the restless energy of a person who had carried tension for too long. The house felt unnaturally quiet that morning, as though holding its breath with her. Every corner of it reminded her of what she had lost: the closed curtains, the silent garden, the faint reflection of the cameras that had stolen her sense of safety. But beneath the fear was something sharper, more certain. She had gathered every piece of evidence, every photograph, every witness statement. Chloe had built the case meticulously, assembling a picture of invasion so complete that no one could pretend it was an accident. Still, Maria's hands trembled when she picked up her bag and locked the door. She whispered a small promise to herself, that by the time she returned, this nightmare would finally begin to end. The courtroom was smaller than she expected, almost intimate, which made the confrontation even more suffocating. Josh sat at the table opposite her, immaculate in a navy suit, his expression calm but his eyes hard, the eyes of a man convinced that charm could rewrite reality. His lawyer spoke first, painting a portrait of a harmless homeowner vilified by an unstable neighbor. The cameras, he argued, were for protection. The drone was for property inspection. The HOA complaints were legitimate concerns. Each statement was polished, each lie delivered with practiced ease. Maria sat still, gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles ached. She could feel the judge's gaze shifting between them, weighing every word, searching for truth in the spaces between. Then it was Chloe's turn. Her voice, calm but edged with conviction, filled the room. She began not with accusations, but with questions. Questions that turned every one of Josh's excuses against him. "If your cameras were meant for protection," she asked, "why did they record activity exclusively on my client's property? Why were there no cameras facing your driveway or front entrance?" Josh shifted in his chair, his composure cracking slightly. Chloe continued, unveiling still images from the recordings, showing how the lenses were angled directly toward Maria's windows and garden. The final image, the one showing her grandchildren playing, made the judge's brow tighten. "And if this footage was so harmless," Chloe said, "why was it stored in folders labeled by date and time, all corresponding to my client's private hours?" The air in the room changed. Even Josh's lawyer faltered, his tone losing its confident rhythm. Chloe pressed further, presenting the drone footage Maria had recovered from the debris, the one that captured his voice faintly laughing about catching her watering plants again. Then came the social media video, the careless post he had made months ago, bragging about how his new system gave him a free show next door. It was damning, undeniable, and devastatingly simple. Josh's face drained of color as the recording played, and for the first time he couldn't look at her. Maria felt no triumph, only a kind of hollow ache as she listened. It wasn't satisfaction she sought. It was vindication, the restoration of truth. When the time came for her to speak, she rose slowly, her voice unsteady at first, but gaining strength as she went on. She told the judge about the fear that had settled into her bones, the humiliation of knowing that her every move might be watched, the toll it had taken on her health, and the way her grandchildren had begun to ask why the man next door didn't like them. Her words weren't dramatic, but they were real, stripped of embellishment. When she finished, the room was silent. Even the clerk paused his typing. The judge's decision came swiftly. The evidence, he said, left no room for ambiguity. The cameras, positioned as they were, represented a deliberate invasion of privacy. The pattern of harassment was clear, sustained, and malicious. The restraining order was granted immediately, forbidding Josh from using or installing any surveillance equipment directed toward Maria's property. The court further ordered him to pay $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and legal costs, and to provide proof that all recordings had been permanently destroyed under supervision. As the words settled in the air, Maria felt her knees weaken. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was the moment she exhaled after months of holding her breath. Josh said nothing as the judge left the bench. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with a hatred that no longer frightened her. When he finally stood and walked past her, she didn't move, didn't flinch. For the first time, he seemed smaller, stripped of the arrogance that had once filled every corner of his presence. Chloe placed a steadying hand on Maria's shoulder, whispering, "It's over." But Maria knew that over was a relative word. The cameras would be gone, the case closed, but the memory of those long months of violation would remain like faint scars beneath the skin. Still, the victory mattered. It restored not just her privacy, but her belief that truth, though slow, could still cut through deceit. That evening, when she returned home, the neighborhood was quiet again. The porch light that had so often blinded her windows was dark. The fence, stripped of its mechanical eyes, stood bare against the twilight. She walked slowly through her garden, touching the wilted plants, feeling the soil cool beneath her fingertips. The silence was different now, no longer oppressive, but healing. When she reached the edge of the yard, she looked toward Josh's house one last time. His blinds were drawn, the windows dark. The tension that had once lived in her chest eased, leaving only exhaustion and relief. She stood there until the first stars appeared, listening to the wind in the trees, a sound she had not truly heard in months. For the first time she felt unseen, unobserved, truly alone, and the absence of that gaze was its own form of freedom. The house behind her seemed to breathe again, alive with quiet. She whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the air, to the universe that had finally tilted toward justice. The cameras were gone, but their memory would remain a reminder of her endurance. And as she turned back toward her home, Maria felt the faintest trace of peace, fragile but real, returning to the place that had always been hers. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the rhythm of Maria's life began to soften again, like a wound learning to close. The mornings no longer began with anxiety, but with the quiet rustle of wind through the cedars. She could walk into her garden without glancing toward the fence, without the instinctive tightening in her chest that had once shadowed every step. The cameras were gone, dismantled under court order, and the dull hum that had haunted her nights was replaced by a natural stillness she had almost forgotten existed. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of watering her flowers and just listen, to birds, to the distant laughter of children, to her own breathing, and feel astonished by how silence could feel so alive. Yet beneath that peace ran a current of solemnity, a quiet understanding of what it had cost her to reclaim it. The neighbors, who had once whispered uncertainly about her, now greeted her with warmth, tinged by remorse. A few apologized outright, ashamed of their earlier disbelief. One woman brought her a pie and said softly, "You were right all along." Maria smiled and accepted their gestures with grace, not out of pride, but because forgiveness felt lighter than bitterness. The HOA, under new leadership, had issued an official statement acknowledging the misuse of its authority, and several board members resigned, including Josh. He had moved away soon after the judgment, his house sitting dark and empty like a monument to arrogance undone. No one in the neighborhood mentioned him anymore. His name carried a kind of uneasy silence, a reminder of how cruelty can hide beneath civility. Inside her home, Maria began to reopen what had been closed. The blinds were lifted, the curtains drawn back, the air filled again with the scent of baking and lavender oil. Her grandchildren returned to the backyard, splashing in the small pool, their laughter echoing like the reclaiming of something sacred. She watched them with a tenderness that bordered on awe, knowing that every sound, every movement was finally hers to keep, unseen and unrecorded. Sometimes, at dusk, she would sit on the patio with a cup of tea, looking at the spot where the first camera had once stared back at her, and she would smile faintly, not out of triumph, but quiet defiance. The local newspaper ran a short article about her case, calling it a landmark victory for privacy rights. Maria didn't seek attention, but she hoped the story might give courage to others who felt small under the weight of intrusion. She wrote a short letter to the editor thanking those who had supported her and reminding readers that privacy was not a privilege, but a boundary that defined dignity itself. It was the kind of thing she might once have told her students, but now it came from a place of hard-earned truth. As autumn deepened and the leaves began to turn gold, Maria found herself rediscovering the serenity she had feared lost forever. The world beyond her fence still carried its noise and conflict, but within her small piece of it, there was order again. The fear that had once ruled her life had become memory, and the memory had become strength. When she looked at her reflection in the window at night, she saw not the fragile woman who had been cornered by someone else's arrogance, but a survivor who had forced the world to look and to listen. The house no longer felt like a hiding place. It was, once more, a home,